What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down 5 must-start running backs moving into Week 4 of the 2023 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year round, free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way in. But more importantly, please get in the comment section down below anything you guys need, starts, sits, waiver wire advice, trade advice, whatever it may be. Let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video. All right, first on the list, I'm going to go ahead and talk about Josh Jacobs. And you guys know for these videos, we're not talking about players like Christian McCaffrey or Bijan Robinson. And some of you might be looking at Jacobs' name and be like, yeah, I mean, you have to start Jacobs. You draft him as your RB1. But if you're a Josh Jacobs owner, I mean, you might be panicking, and rightfully so. I mean, Jacobs is coming off an 11-point performance in Week 3 against Pittsburgh. That was his best mark of the season so far. Through the first 2 weeks, 9.9 or less fantasy points in each of those 2 games. So he just hit double digits and barely did it in Week 3. He hasn't scored a single touchdown so far this season. He's been ultimately very disappointing, especially comparative to last season. But I will say this matchup against the Chargers is a really good opportunity for Josh Jacobs to bounce back. This Chargers run defense has not been good on the season so far. They were fine statistically in Week 3 against the Vikings, but let's face it, that was a pass-first game for both units out there. The second half, there's no reason to do anything but throw the football. So I'm not reading too much into that. This Chargers defense has still been really soft against the run. Now, you could argue this Chargers team probably better than this Raiders unit, whose secondary is not good. I mean, they're going to throw the football first, could get up early on the Raiders, which could force the Raiders to throw the football more than run the football. But you know, while I could see that happening, I still think the volume will be there for Josh Jacobs, and the volume has been there so far throughout the season. 17 rushing attempts last week, 5 targets in Week 2. I mean, a blowout game, but still 9 rushing attempts, 6 targets. And in Week 1, 19 rushing attempts and 3 targets. So Jacobs is still getting enough volume to create those opportunities. He just hasn't quite done it so far this season. But I think this is a good bounce back opportunity for Jacobs in Week 4 against a soft defense in the Chargers. So I say you go ahead and roll him out one more time. If he performs poorly, then maybe he's getting downgraded to your RB2, or maybe you've been able to pick up a player off the waivers like Javonte Williams or Jerome Ford, who you're going to consider starting over Jacobs. But I say here in Week 4, Jacobs remains a player that needs to be in your starting lineups as we move into the week. All right, next up on the list, I'm going to go ahead and talk about James Cook of the Buffalo Bills, currently sitting as the RB13 in fantasy football. He's hit 10 or more fantasy points each game in full PPR so far this year, getting a lot of good receiving work, and has looked pretty dang efficient on the ground as well. 13.2 fantasy points against Washington in Week 3, 98 yards on the ground, 6.5 yards per carry off of 15 rushing attempts, 3 targets for an additional 14 receiving yards. So we're still yet to see Cook find the end zone. Latavius Murray, surprisingly over Damian Harris, has been vulturing all the touchdowns, but Cook still hitting double digits on a week-to-week basis. And we might look at this game, you know, away at Miami and kind of be like, I don't know how confident I feel. But guys, the Bills are going to at least keep this game competitive, and they're going to do whatever they can to match the offensive firepower of the Miami Dolphins, who have been pretty soft against the run so far this year. I mean, Week 3 might kind of skew that stat, but I mean, what were the Broncos supposed to do other than throw the football for a majority of that game? So I still think this is a good matchup against the Dolphins for the Bills running backs. I think that Cook is going to be the most involved running back like he's been so far throughout the season. I think he's a safe lock for double digits in this matchup, which I think will have quite a few points scored. It's a good opportunity for James Cook to keep up the pace he's on. If you own him, he's a solid RB2 moving into Week 4. All right, next up on the list, I'm going to talk about a player who on paper doesn't have the best matchup, or at least has a matchup that we look at and we kind of think, oh, I absolutely can't start this guy. And that's James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. And listen, Conner so far on the year has looked like one of the best mid to late round running back selections in drafts, especially if he can stay healthy. I mean, 12 or more fantasy points in full PPR each game so far, coming off of his best mark on the season in Week 3 at 19.6 fantasy points. against the Dallas Cowboys, who going into that matchup were the #1 ranked defense against opposing running backs in fantasy. He had 98 rushing yards, a touchdown, and 2 receptions for a total of 19.6 fantasy points. So, yeah, we look at San Francisco and we say, I don't know if I want to start my running back against them, but said the same thing in week 3 against the Dallas Cowboys for James Conner. And like I said, his best fantasy mark on the season so far. And, this isn't a away game for the Cardinals. We'll see how it shapes out. But if Matt Breida can find a way to put up 10 fantasy points against this Niners defense, I don't see why James Conner, who's been extremely efficient so far this year, can't do the same. So if you own James Conner, you're kind of looking at your bench trying to make a decision. I still think he's a solid RB2 as we approach the week. This Cardinals offense has some fight to them. It's a really tough matchup. This Niners team is as efficient as it comes on both sides of the ball. We know this defense has a ton of playmakers up front. Could turn into a rough day, but I still think the volume is going to be there for James Conner. He's produced in every game so far. If you own him, don't bench him. He's a player you should be starting moving into week 4. All right, next on the list, I'm going to talk about a player who admittedly I'm not 100% confident in. That's Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. Listen, he hasn't scored more than 9.7 fantasy points so far on the season. We know that Samaje Perine's kind of lurking around, taking some touches as well. We know that this Broncos team is literally coming off of the worst loss in NFL history since 1966. I mean, there's a lot of question marks here, don't get me wrong. But guys, they're facing the next most disastrous team in the entire NFL. You guys have heard me talk about this matchup already throughout the videos a couple times this week, but this matchup between the Broncos and the Bears, I don't see a lot of defense showing up in this game whatsoever. This Chicago Bears defense, I mean, they just gave up 3 rushing touchdowns, and it was like in less than like 15 minutes against the Kansas City Chiefs. I mean, this rushing defense has been awful all year round. They got absolutely torched in week 2 by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They got absolutely torched in week 1 by the Green Bay Packers. I don't think it matters who they're playing. The running back position against the Bears is something we're going to be looking at throughout the entire season. They could easily finish as the worst unit against a run on the entire season if they keep up this pace. So do I love Javonte Williams? Not really. I haven't really been a believer of him going into this year, but this is a really good opportunity for him to get over that hump of these single-digit performances, find the end zone, and give you double-digit fantasy points. So I know a lot of you guys out there are struggling. We've seen so many injuries so far on the season, including some big names at the running back position. We'll see if some of those guys like Eckler and Barkley are ready for week 4 or not. But nonetheless, I think Javonte Williams, if you own him, he's worth quote unquote streaming against the Chicago Bears. He's seen the most volume in terms of the running back position easily on this roster. He has at least 11 rushing attempts and 3 targets in each game this season. I don't expect an incredibly high ceiling, but this matchup against the Bears is simply too good to ignore. If you own Javonte Williams, you need to give him strong consideration moving into week 4. All right, next on the list, I'm going to go ahead and go with Miles Sanders going up against the Minnesota Vikings at home in week 4. Sanders coming off of his best fantasy performance so far in week 3 against the Seattle Seahawks, 17.2 fantasy points, 9 rushing attempts for 24 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. He added 9 targets, 5 receptions, and 38 receiving yards. So we don't really know going into this matchup, is Bryce Young going to be the starting quarterback or is Andy Dalton? It looked like, to a degree at least, Sanders gained a little bit extra momentum with Dalton at quarterback, but I'm not too worried about it. The encouraging thing I think we saw out of this week 3 performance was Chuba Hubbard only had 1 rushing attempt. He did have 3 targets, but in the past couple weeks before that, whether it was through the passing game or on the ground, Chuba was starting to eat into some of that overall volume, which could have had to do with Miles Sanders recovering from a groin injury. But nonetheless, we know Sanders is good to go at this point in the season. It's a good matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who have not been good so far against the run this season. They've been in the bottom 12. Week 3 stat line could skew that a little bit. But I mean, once again, that Chargers-Vikings game was a throw the football game, so I'm not reading too much into it. It's a good matchup. The Panthers are at home. I'm really not too worried about if it's Bryce Young or Andy Dalton as he's starting quarterback. Miles Sanders took big advantage of a soft matchup in week 3 against the Seattle Seahawks. He gets another soft matchup at home against the Minnesota Vikings in week 4. You probably drafted Sanders as like an RB2, maybe an RB3. And due to those beginning of the season injuries, he's probably floated around your roster in different areas, RB2, flex, bench, whatever it is. But I think he's going to come back into that RB2 territory as things start to get going. He faces Detroit, then Miami in the next following weeks before a bye week as well. So he's got some good opportunities here, but especially here in week 4, I think this is a great opportunity for him to keep up some of what he did in week 3. I think he's a really strong start as we move in to week 4. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, this is all we do here all year round. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. But more importantly, guys, please get in the comment section down below anything that you guys need, starts, sits, trades, waivers, anything pertaining to the 2023 fantasy football season. Let me know down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And with that, I will say, thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.